Our last and final speaker, and to prove that we're not hopelessly London-centric, it is Reka Solymosi from University of Manchester, and she's going to be talking about fear of COVID, functional and dysfunctional fear of COVID. So Reka, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I want to figure out how to get rid of my face from here. Done. Okay, so as Ben said, I'm talking about functional and dysfunctional fear of COVID-19 and discussing a little bit this classification scheme that we have applied. So to give a little background, one of the other things what people were talking about in relation to COVID-19 was this sort of narrative of worry and how the effect that worry was having on people during these times. So one of the narratives around this was that it inhibits normal life and that people are sort of scared to go outside and they might be complying with measures because of this fear, and this might inhibit them re-engaging and these sorts of things. But of course, there's also these consequences of fear that people are talking about around negative well-being outcomes. So the constant worry and anxiety around COVID-19 having consequences for mental health. And then because of this, it's also become this focus of various interventions designed to get people sort of out of the state of worry or support people who are having lots of anxiety and worry and experiencing negative consequences of these things. So this is why we decided to look at this topic. Specifically though, when the worry was being discussed, it was really just considered as this bad thing. So people are just worried, there's all these negative consequences, but actually there's a lot of work around this area that distinguishes between dysfunctional and functional worry about things in general. So dysfunctional worry we can think of as this kind of really destructive, negative force, whereas functional worry can be seen as more constructive. So what do I mean? Well, destructive worry contains elements like overestimating risk. It has it can create anxiety in the people experiencing this, and this can result in people withdrawing from their everyday activities and from being part of society. On the other hand, constructive worry is more associated with problem solving. So that is where people, for example, might take precautions as a result of their worry, which then in turn make them safer and defend them from the sort of object of their worry. But of course, one of the criteria for this to be constructive is that this worry should have no effect on the person's quality of life. So that's one of the big differences between this destructive and constructive experiences of worry. So to give an example, this has been applied to worry about crime or fear of crime to distinguish between these instances of functional worry and dysfunctional worry. And when creating these typologies and looking at crime and sort of causes and consequences, studies have found that, for example, victimization to be associated with dysfunctional worry, and also outcomes such as negative health problems, but also perceiving your neighborhood as more disorderly and so having low collective efficacy, all to be associated with the dysfunctional kind of worry. And on the other hand, functional worry is very much associated with taking precautions. So getting burglar alarms or taking these precautions to prevent becoming a victim of crime. So this is functional dysfunctional worry in sort of other spheres. But what we wanted to see is, does this functional dysfunctional worry map onto the fear of COVID-19? So to do this, we asked people whether they felt worried. So we can see from our sample of these results, by the way, are from wave 2. Chris mentioned in the beginning that we started asking these questions in wave 2. So we asked whether people had felt worried about contracting COVID-19, And you can see the majority of people, over 60% said that yes, they were worried. But some people said, no, I'm not worried about getting COVID-19. But then we asked a series of other follow-up questions to see, to be able to distinguish between dysfunctional worry and to see what kind of consequences that worry might have. So the question we ask here is, to what extent was the person's quality of life reduced by their worry? And so we left the person to define quality of life for themselves, but you can see there is a range of answers from our participants, from yes, I worry, but it's not at all or only a little bit reducing my quality of life, to some people having moderately, quite a bit, and very much reduced quality of life due to their worry. And we also asked the follow-up questions of whether or not people take precautions. And you can see most people, even the people who were not worried, they said, yes, I take precautions against COVID-19. And very, very few people said that they do not take any precautions. But again, these precautions might differ. So we asked people a list of possible precautions that they might take, which we can understand as being sort of more or less intense, essentially. So things like keeping a safe distance or not using public transport is, in one scale, whereas avoiding going out entirely or something like that is a much more intensive. And we also ask people to tell us about the precautions they take in this first iteration of these questions to see if anything we're missing. But I think these illustrate the kind of different levels of precautions that people take. So there's people who are talking about sort of extensive hand washing when you can, or using alcohol gel when they can't. And then I think this was Chris's favorite precaution that came up, which was somebody who said that they will not kiss or snuggle their cat because the cat goes outside. And you can probably imagine that this kind of precaution might have some pretty serious impact on someone's quality of life. So to ascertain these, we also asked people about how they perceive these precautions which they are taking. So we asked, to what extent do these precautions make you feel safer? So is there any point to taking them in the first place? And you can see it was not zero who said, I think it was maybe 5 people who said they take precautions, they do not at all make them feel safer. But for most people, there's some positive impact. But also it's possible that these precautions affect the quality of life. And indeed, we see this in some of our participants. So how did we use this to create a classification scheme? I'll walk through sort of the steps of sorting people. So first, we asked if they are worried or not. If they replied that they are not, then this group became the sort of unworried group. So they don't have any worries, they're unworried, so they don't count. Then if they did say that they are worried, we asked, does the worry affect quality of life, which I showed earlier? And if they said, yes, it does, then these people would be put in the dysfunctional group because their quality of life is affected by their worry. Then if they said no, we ask everyone, but if they said no, we then look at their answers for precautions. Do they take precautions? If no, well, they're worried, but there's no sort of positive outcome of taking precautions, so they're also not functional, so we put them in the dysfunctional group. If they do take precautions, we then ask, do these precautions affect your quality of life? And if they do, then again, we have a reduction in quality of life, so that's a dysfunctional worry. Finally, we ask, do the precautions make you feel safer? And if they don't, that's still not very useful precautions, so it's a dysfunctional worry group. But if they answered yes to this, then that select group who've made it down these steps, they make up our functionally worried group at the end. So this is how we came up with the classification scheme. And having a look at our participants, we found that we had 35% of people who were just not worried at all. They're the unworried group. 22% who fall into this functional worry group, and 43% who are in this dysfunctionally worried group. So we can look at some of the differences between them. So first, we looked at this kind of victimization to draw the parallel with the fear of crime example. So we looked at 2 sort of equivalents of COVID-19 victimization. One is whether or not they had COVID-19. And that's including self-identified or self-diagnosed. Tests weren't all that prevalent back then. And also whether they were affected by COVID-19 in the ways which Chris described earlier in terms of lost job, lost income, can't buy food, these sorts of negative outcomes that they're experiencing because of COVID-19. So we found that actually if they had, so functionally worried group had COVID-19 more so than compared to the unworried, whereas for dysfunctional worry had the negative outcomes, so the job loss and housing loss and those kinds of things, compared to the unworried. So that's for sort of victimization by COVID. And then we also looked at differences in the emotional well-being outcomes, right? So again, Chris described these questions in the first talk, but this was made up of whether the participants had felt anxiety, anger, loneliness, whether they had not felt happy, they're not at all satisfied with life, or they say that life is not at all worthwhile. And looking at the differences between the different groups, we find that actually the functionally worried group fare the best out of the three. So in this case, it definitely seems like dividing worry into functional and dysfunctional really distinguishes the different kinds of outcomes on emotional well-being that we saw. And putting it into our models, you can see here for functional worry compared to the unworried, you have this as putting the scores on the emotional well-being together, you have less negative outcomes, whereas with dysfunctional worry, you have more of the negative outcomes for emotional well-being. So this is indicating to us that, yep, we should be breaking up that big group of worry into these different components. We also looked at compliance and re-engagement. So I think John mentioned these in his talk. For the sort of the mock score or mock sum score of compliance, we didn't find much for. I think this was social distancing was the only case where it seemed like those who were functionally worried were less likely to be non-compliant with the social distancing, but in this other types of compliance, it didn't really show up. And then looking at re-engagement, so the differences between wave 2 and 3 in terms of participating or breaking these rules, because in wave 3, it wasn't really breaking the rules anymore. There was nothing, no association there that we could find. So we saw these outcomes and we see these groups and okay, there's these difference of the different worry groups, but does this worry change? Is there any point of us trying to identify somebody who's dysfunctionally worried? Can we move them into a functional worried group? So to look at this, simply looked at the flow between where people fit into in wave 2. So which group they were categorized into, unworried, the functional worry, or dysfunctional worry. And then looked at the same people to see where they ended up based on their answers to the same questions in wave 3. And looking at this indicates that, yep, there is definitely some movement between the groups. And so the reason that that can be interesting is we can think about what are some ways of maybe nudging people from the dysfunctional worry into the other ones. To understand that, we looked at differences in these elements of risk perceptions, specifically how likely people think it is that they'll catch COVID-19, how severe the consequences of it they perceive, and how much control they perceive over catching COVID-19. And we can see again that it's the functional, it's a dysfunctional worry group that have the sort of more negative outcomes on each one of these measures. So looking in this case, comparing both the unworried and the functional worry group to the dysfunctional worry group as reference category, we can see for the likelihood, both the unworried and functionally worried groups perceive themselves less likely to be getting COVID-19 than the dysfunctionally worried, but they perceive higher control over the extent to which they are likely to get COVID-19, and they perceive lower severity. So both unworried and functionally worried perceive lower severity of consequences than do the dysfunctionally worried people in our group. So what does that mean for our conclusions? Well, we've created this classification system as dysfunctional and functional fear of COVID-19. And we found that whether someone had COVID-19, they were in, these are the wrong way around. They were in functional, and if they were affected by COVID-19, they were in dysfunctional. We found that the emotional well-being is sort of best for the functionally worried, then the unworried, then the dysfunctionally worried groups. Compliance, it doesn't really seem that worry has much of an effect. And this is the same for the case of re-engagement with the activities that were previously not permitted under lockdown. We found that people can move between groups. So that might be one approach to have some targeted messaging or some sort of information sharing to inform risk perception. And that might be a way of getting people to move between these groups. And so what does this mean for now? Well, if there's new lockdown, it might mean new worries. So this is a good time to explore ways of transitioning people into maybe more functional types of worry. But it seems like there's no point really to try and scare people into compliance because we didn't find any sort of support for that. So that's it from me.